Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for module number 3. We're going to be writing triads and writing them in 3 and 4 voices in this video. So what we're going to try to accomplish is be able to define the term voicing, what that means. We're going to be able to voice a chord in different spacings, which means in closed structure or open structure. And we'll also be able to become familiar with the rules of voice crossing and spacing and how that affects what we're going to do with writing triads. And we're going to learn the ranges of each voice part that we will be using in our ensemble this semester. Okay, so let's talk about exactly what we're doing, because that may have been a little bit confusing because we're used to writing triads, right? We know what a triad is, we know how to create those. Well, this is a specific thing called voicing a triad in 3 or 4 voices. So what we're really going to do is learn how to take a triad that's on a single staff that we're used to seeing, right? And we're going to expand it, write it out into a score. So something that could be performed by an ensemble. So we're going from a single staff, this A triad here, which sounds like this, right? And we're going to spread that across 2 staves in a score. Okay, so it creates a fuller sound. So let's talk about what a score is. A score is just a written version of the music that contains all of the parts of the piece. So a score has everything that all of the musicians, all the singers, that everyone is playing or singing. Okay, it's used by a conductor to tell, make sure everybody's doing the right thing. It's used by composers so that they can write everything and see it all happening at once. And it's used in theory to kind of analyze what's happening in a piece of music. And there are different kinds. There's a full score. This is usually what a conductor would use. And a full score has a line for every single part. So in an orchestra, every single instrument would get its own line, and that would all exist in this full score so that a conductor or whoever can see it and be like, okay, well, that horn, you need to do this during this part, right? Okay. There's also a thing called a reduced score, and that's when more than one part is notated on a single line. And that's mostly what we're going to be doing in our class. So for the rest of the semester, really, we'll be focusing on writing music for a 3 or 4 part vocal ensemble. And we'll we'll be writing it on what's called a reduced score, on which we will have 1 or 2 parts on each line. Okay, so you'll see here that there are 4 parts to this score, right? And all 4 parts can be seen really easily on this 2-stave score. Okay, so let's talk about what this is specifically. The 4 parts of the vocal ensemble that we're going to be using are called the soprano, right? And the soprano is the highest voice that we'll have, the highest part that we'll have. Then we'll have the alto, which is the second highest. Then we'll have the tenor, which is below that. And then we'll have the lowest voice called the bass. Okay? And they'll always go in that order. This combination of voices, parts, is so common that it's often abbreviated as SATB. So you might even see that in like choral music and stuff like that. Someone says this is an SATB score. That just means it's a vocal ensemble that has a soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And we'll be using this combination because it really informs how to write other kinds of music too. So this is an approach that composers of this style of music have taken for a very long time. And it's really easy to kind of expand what you do with these 4 voices into something larger too. So that's kind of why composers and theorists and students use this kind of score. Okay, so in our score that we just looked at, the 2 highest parts, the soprano and the alto, are written on the top treble clef staff. So here you'll see that we have both of the parts, the soprano and the alto, on that top line. Okay, the soprano is on top, the alto is on bottom. And the reason we know that one is on top and one is on the bottom is because of the way the stems face. So the notes of the soprano part always have upward stems, and that makes it look like they're separate from what's going on at the bottom, right? the notes of the alto part will always have downward stems. And that just makes it easier to see, right? If all the stems were facing the same direction, you wouldn't be able to pull them apart visually, all right? So soprano and alto are written on the same staff, the top treble clef, and the soprano notes will always have an upward stem, and the alto notes will always have a downward stem. And the tenor and bass, likewise, are written on the lower bass clef staff. And the tenor will always have upward stems, just like the soprano does, and the bass will have downward stems. Okay? So we have SA, soprano and alto, up top, and tenor and bass on the bottom, TB. Okay, so let's talk about what it means to voice a triad. Whenever we take a triad from a single staff, right, which is what we had here, an A major triad, and we write it in a score, what we have to do is we have to choose which part, and in this case, the soprano, alto, tenor, or bass, gets which note of the chord. So which note are we going to give to the soprano? Which note are we going to give to the bass? Which note are we going to give to the alto? What are we going to do with the tenor, right? We're picking which notes we want to give to each part. So here, we're taking the C sharp in the middle of this chord, and we're giving it to the soprano. Okay? We're taking the E at the top of this chord and giving that to the alto. And we're taking the A at the bottom of the chord and we're giving it to the tenor, and we're also repeating it, we're doubling it in the bass. So we go from this sound, right, to a more spread out sound. Right? It's the same triad. It's still an A major triad, but it's spread out. We've given a different part of the triad to each voice in our ensemble. This is what's called voicing a chord, because we're choosing which note, which voice gets which note. Okay. Voicing has an important effect on the way a chord sounds, and here are some examples of the different sounds you can get from different voicings. And of course, this depends on the instruments it's played on too. So this is kind of a sort of an effect. It will always sound different when you actually have singers or different instruments or whatever, right? But it kind of demonstrates the variety of different sounds you can get from different voicings. So in this first measure, all the notes are very close to each other, and you get kind of a pale, sort of neutral sound. Right? Very definite, very stable. In the next example, we've spread out the bass and the tenor a little bit more, so we get a slightly darker sound. And in the third measure, we've spread out the voices even more, so we get kind of a bright and dark sound, kind of covering all the different registers. It's a very full effect with that one. And in the next one, we have an octave between the soprano and the alto, so we get sort of an hollow effect, which makes it sound very stark, kind of. Very thin kind of sound, I think. And then in the last effect, we have the interval of a perfect fifth in the bass and the tenor, which makes it sound very stable, very complete. And we spread out the voices between the alto and the soprano up top. So we get this really nice kind of ending kind of sound. So those are all the same triad. We're not changing the harmony at all. All we're doing is just changing how the notes are voiced, right? How they are arranged for this ensemble. And it makes a pretty big difference, depending on how you voice it. Okay. So in general, there are just two ways that a chord can be voiced, and that's sort of true, sort of not true, but we break them into two categories. The first is what's called close structure, or you could say close structure. I'm not sure which one's correct, actually. And that's whenever the distance between the soprano and the tenor is less than an octave. So in other words, it means all of the notes of the triad are right next to each other. So if we kind of put this on one staff, you'd see that the top voices go C sharp, E, A. So those are all the notes of our A major triad. And the effect is kind of this closed kind of sound. Okay, and again, what defines it is you have an interval that's less than an octave between the soprano, which is an A, and the tenor, which in this case is C sharp. So that's within an octave. We call that a close structure or closed structure. Okay. And then the other way of doing it is the open structure, and that just means that the distance between the soprano and the tenor is more than an octave. And this is where we get our spread out kind of sound. Right? Kind of a mixture of darkness and lightness, really. And what defines this kind of voicing is that we have more than an octave between our soprano, that A, and our tenor, that E in bass clef. Okay, so those are the two general ways you can voice a triad. All right, now a couple other things. We'll talk about this more in class too. There are two simple rules when voicing in triad and 3 or 4 voices. And the first is that no part should have a note that is above the soprano note or below the bass note. So in other words, you don't want to write your alto note so that it goes above your soprano note. You don't want to write your tenor note so that it goes below the bass note. Because the two most important parts of this kind of ensemble, this kind of writing, are the soprano on top and the bass on the bottom. And if any of your other voices cross that, it will disrupt what's going on between those two voices, which is what is the most important thing. Okay? And then the other thing to keep in mind is that the interval between adjacent voices, so in other words, between the soprano and the alto, or the alto and the tenor, that should never be more than an octave. And the only exception is between the tenor and the bass. That can be more than an octave. And in class, we'll go over some more examples. But it's really similar to how when we were writing our 2-part counterpoint, we couldn't write a distance more than a tenth, right? Well, here, when we have two voices that are on top of each other, we can't make that space more than an octave, except between the tenor and the bass. Okay. And the last thing to keep in mind is that we're writing vocal music. So the conception of this style of music, even though it does apply to other areas too, is that this is vocal music. So we have to keep in mind that a voice part, right, a soprano, an alto, tenor, bass, can only sing certain pitches. And they can only sing pitches that are within their vocal range. So when picking a note for each part to sing, you have to make sure that the note is within the correct ranges. So all the way on the left is the soprano range. So they can sing from the middle C up to the G. Okay, so that's why it's always on top. And the alto is the one next to that, and that can go all the way down to a G and go up to a D. The tenor can sing from a low C to a E above middle C. And then the bass can sing from a low E to the middle C. And that's the general ranges of these voices. Now, you may be saying, well, I'm a soprano and I can sing an A, or I can sing a B, or I'm a bass and I can definitely get down to that low C, Dr. Perriman. What are you talking about? So what we're talking about is these are the ranges for singing in church on Sunday morning by your average guy, right? Average girl, whatever. Like the person who's not necessarily trained and doesn't have an amazing vocal range, right? These are things that you're comfortable singing, at 10 o'clock at a church service, because this is all church music. So we would say that these are very conservative estimates for ranges, and everybody has a different voice, but these are kind of the averages that people can get to. So it's best to kind of stick with these. Now, if you did something like wrote an F, high F and a tenor, I wouldn't really get mad about that. If you wrote a low D in the bass, it's fine. Same thing with the soprano. If you really want to go up to an A, that's fine, right? These are just suggested ranges where if you follow this, things will work out great. And anything outside of it is kind of risky. So it's okay to do other things, but just be aware that this is the average range. So whenever you're picking notes, you want to make sure that it's within these general ranges. Okay. So let's look at some examples that are similar to what's in the workbook, and I'll kind of work these with you. So some of them ask you to write chords in 3 voices, and some ask you to write them in 4 voices. So let's start with ones in 3 voices. So in three voices, it's really easy because we're dealing with only triads. A triad has only 3 notes, so each part should get one of the notes of the chord. And really all you have to do is choose. And of course, make sure that you're fitting into the vocal ranges and you are spacing things correctly. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. So let's work on these here. Okay, so for the examples in the workbook, you're always given some notes to start with, right? You'll either be given the soprano and the bass or just the soprano, but it gives you some guidance to get started with this. You're always given the name of the key down here, and if it's lowercase, it's going to be minor. So this is the key of G minor. And then you're given in Roman numerals which chord, which triad they want you to create on the staff. Okay? So this is saying they want you to voice a 5 chord in the key of G minor. And the voice that they want you to write for 3 voices is always circled here. So this is saying it wants you to write the alto voice here. So provide the alto voice. Okay. So this really isn't that hard. So in the key of G minor, we want to spell the 5 chord. Now you could do a couple things. You might want to just write out what that chord is in the key of G minor first, and then decide where you want it to go. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'll just kind of write it off to the side here. So in the key of G minor, the root of the 5 chord is going to be D. Okay, so I would write a D. And then the rest of the notes will be F and A. Now pay attention to what else is going on here. This is a capital V, right? And we're in minor, so we know that that means this needs to be a major triad. And if I just played it, we'd have D, F natural A, which is a minor triad. So because it's capital, it needs to be major. So I need to change that F natural into an F sharp. Okay, so this is the triad I'm trying to spell, a D major triad. Now I need to figure out what's missing from this chord and then decide what I need to add to make this chord complete. So just kind of look what's here. I have a D already in my bass, so I don't need that. I have an A already in the soprano. So the note that I need to add to complete this, to make it a 5 chord, is going to be this F sharp. And I need to add it to the alto, so it has to be within the alto range. And it has to be within an octave of our top part. So I can write it right here, where I figured out it should go earlier, right? There. So this creates, that F sharp creates a full 5 chord in the key of G minor. That's all there is to it. Okay, let's look at the next one. So the next one's in the key of D major, and it's asking me to voice a 7 diminished chord in this key. Okay, so let's figure out what that chord is first. So in the key of D major, the root of a 7 chord is going to be C sharp. So I'll go ahead and write that here. So I'll use here, so C sharp. The rest of my notes are going to be an E and then also a G. So that gives me my 7 diminished chord in the key of D major. Okay. Now we need to figure out what's missing, essentially. So we see that we already have a C sharp in our bass, so we don't need that. Okay. We already have an E in our soprano, so we don't need that. So the note that we do need is a G. Okay, and that needs to be within an octave of our soprano, and it needs to be within the alto range. So I can kind of leave it there where I wrote on the staff. So I could put the G here, and that would complete my 7 diminished triad in the key of D. So there you go. That's really all there is to it. 3 voices is pretty simple because you don't have to make any decisions except for adhering to the vocal range and making sure things are within an octave, right? But every note should be represented because you have 3 voices and there are 3 notes in a triad. So that's not that bad. Okay, so let's look at some examples in 4 voices. So in 4 voices, like we have here, we end up with a slight problem, and that's because a triad only has 3 notes, like we just saw. So that means that one of the notes of the triad needs to be doubled. And doubled just means it needs to be repeated. So in the case of that A major triad before, we doubled the A, the root, in the tenor and the bass. So both the bass and the tenor had an A. Okay? And that's all we're doing with doubling. And you have to do it when you're voicing a triad in 4 voices because there aren't enough notes to go around. You have 4 people who want to sing, right? And you only have 3 notes, so you need to double them. You need to share them. Okay. So for now, and there are other rules that will change, of course, because it's music theory, but for now, it's best to double the root of the chord. So whatever the root of the chord is, that's the one you want to double. And that's basically the rule we'll follow for a while. Okay. So let's look at how to do this in 4 voices and keeping that doubling rule in mind. So there are a couple of different ways that the book asks you to do this. And the first is kind of like we did with 4 voices, where it will tell you which voices it wants you to add. And it's up to you to just add those, right? So that's what the first 2 are here. It says soprano, the alto is circled, and the tenor is circled. So that means you need to add the alto notes and you need to add the tenor notes, okay? And again, it's based on the triad that they're asking for here, the Roman numeral they're asking for down here by the key. Okay, so for this one, in the key of B flat major, it wants a 1 chord. So let's figure out what the 1 chord is in B flat major. Well, that's pretty easy. That's going to be B flat, because that's the first note of the scale, D, that's the 3rd of the chord, and F, that's the 5th of the chord. So the 1 chord in B flat major is just a B flat major triad. Okay, so how do we voice this? Well, there's a lot of different options for something like this. So let's figure out what's already there. We already have a B flat in both the soprano and the bass, so we don't need a B flat at all. Okay, so we need to find a home for the D and the F. Well, let's see if we can put the D in our alto. So let's voice that here. Okay, and that fits our rules fine because that's within an octave of our soprano, right? And it's within the range of the alto, so that's fine. So we got home for that. And let's see if we can find a home for the F. Now, maybe we could write a high F up here, right? Well, that is outside of the range of the tenor, right? It's too high. It also is technically above our alto, so that crosses the voices, which is also not a good thing. And so that's not the best place for that F. So maybe we can put that somewhere else. Maybe we can put the F down here. Okay, and that F is within an octave of the alto, so the spacing between our alto and tenor is less than an octave, which is great. And so that completes our chord. So that is a perfectly good way to do this. Now, is it the only way to do this? No, it's not. You could do it another way too. You could have put the F in the alto because that's within its range and it's within an octave of the soprano. And you could have given the note D to the tenor. That also would have worked. And it's okay because you can have more than an octave between our bass and our tenor, right? So that's another legitimate way that you could have done that. So that is 2 good ways of doing that. Both are correct. Okay, so we're getting into the point where with music theory where there is more than one right answer to stuff. And, you know, there are a whole lot of things that you want to avoid, but there are also a whole lot of ways that you can correctly complete these things. So that's an example of 2 different ways to get the right answer. Okay, over here, this one's in the key of E, and it wants a 4 chord in that key. So let's figure out what that chord is first. So in the key of E, the 4th note of the scale is an A. So this will have a root of an A. And it's a major chord, so we'll have an A, a C sharp, and an E. And by the way, all these accidentals are in the key signature, so don't forget about that. So there's our chord that we want to voice. And let's see what we already have. Well, we already have an A, right? And we already have an E in the soprano, so we don't need that. So all we really need to do is find a home for a C sharp. But we also need to double the root. So since there's only 3 notes, we want to double the root, right? Because we don't have enough notes to go around. So I'm going to put a little plus to say that we need to double that note. Okay, well, let's find a home for all these notes. So first thing to find is a home for a C sharp. Well, maybe we can put that in our alto because that's within its range, right? And then we need to find a home for our doubled A. So the easiest place to put that would be here, right? So there you go. That's a good voicing for this chord. Some things we probably couldn't have done would be to maybe make that alto the A and then do a C sharp here. I guess technically that would work, but I guess you could do that. There's really nothing wrong with that. It's a little dark. So yeah, if you wanted a dark effect, I guess you could do that. There's really nothing wrong with it. It just is a little bit unusual. Although I'm not sure, I think it is within the tenor range. I'd have to check that. That's questionable. So this is a questionable one. You have to check the tenor range. I'm not sure if the tenor can go down to that C sharp or not. Okay. So I think the best choice for that one, though, is the first choice, because that is definitely within the range. So that's the best way to do that one. Okay. Now, in the last two examples, it's a little bit different. So the second part of the exercises we're going to do, or actually it's the fourth part, asks you to voice the chord as either close or open. And close just means that between the soprano and the tenor is less than an octave, right? So all the notes of the triad are lined up. Or open means it's more spread out. The distance between the soprano and the tenor is more than an octave, okay? So let's do this first one. It's asking you for the close, and you'll see that we don't have a bass note, okay? So for these, we're always going to put the bass note in, or the root of the chord in the bass. So let's start with this one. It wants a 2 diminished triad in the key of E minor. So that's going to be an F sharp, an A, and a C natural. Okay, and we already have an A, so we don't really need to find a home for that. And we need to find a place for an F sharp and a C sharp. Well, the F sharp should definitely go in the bass, so let's go ahead and just put that here. Okay, you could go to the lower F sharp, I guess, but it's always best, I think, to stick to the middle of the staff if you can. So stick to that F sharp there. Now we need to find a home for a C sharp and another F sharp, because we're going to double the root. So if we want this to be closed position, our tenor needs to be a C sharp, because it cannot be that F sharp again, because that would be more than an octave. So in order to keep this distance less than an octave, we need to have the C sharp in the tenor. And then that means our alto can get that F sharp. And if you looked at this on the piano, you'd see that we'd have C sharp, F sharp, A, I'm sorry, C natural, F sharp, A, right? Which is all within an octave, which are all the voice notes of the triad lined up. So that's what we call close position. Okay. And then let's look at this last one in the key of F minor. It wants a 5 chord in open position. So let's figure out what chord that would be first. So the 5th note of F is the note C. So this chord is going to have a C, an E natural, right, because it is a capital V and we're also in minor, and it's going to have a G. So we're basically just trying to spell a C major triad. We already have the E natural, so we don't need to find a home for that. We need to find a home for our C and our G. And we want to put the root of the chord in the bass. So I'll use this one here. Okay. You could probably use the top one too, and we might have to change it to that, but we'll see. All right, we want to find a home for a G and another C. Well, maybe we could put the C in our alto. Let's try that. So C here. All right, and then maybe we can put our G in our tenor here. So the problem with that is that between this C and this low G, right, and the bass clef is definitely more than an octave. And even though we're trying to do open voices, we still need to make sure that there's less than an octave between adjacent voices, right? So between the tenor and the alto should be less than an octave. So that voicing is not going to work because there's too much space between those voices. So let's do it the other way. Let's put the G in the alto. So we'll do that. Now we have less than an octave between the E natural and the G. And so we can double our bass note, double our root in the tenor, which again, that's less than an octave between the tenor and the alto, so that's good. But it's more than an octave between our tenor and our soprano, which is what we want because we want open voicing. So this is what this would sound like, which is a nice full voicing. Okay, there you go. So that's some examples of how to voice these triads in 4 voices and 3 voices, keeping in mind the rules about spacing, the vocal ranges, and the rules about doubling, and of course rules about cross voicing and stuff like that. Okay, well, thanks for watching. We'll go over more of this in the class, and I know it's probably a lot to take in, but we will be doing this a lot. So yeah, it's best to learn these rules now, and we will definitely be reviewing them and applying them, which will help us learn them very quickly. Okay, great. Have a good night.